All right, so as a kind of special addition to our discussion of the Second World War, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about a pop culture icon from the Second World War, and that is, of course, Captain America. So I'm going to do a series of 6 little short lectures talking a bit about Captain America, his development, and kind of his place in this event, as well as in American pop culture generally. So the first thing we want to talk a little bit about are comic books in general. So comic books began as inserts in other periodicals. They were simply reprints, usually of comic strips that had been published in newspapers that had originally commissioned them. There are 2 things that are going to happen, though, that will give comic books a place of their own as well. So the first of these is that a new use is found for comic books. Oftentimes they would be used as giveaways inside adult publications or products so that children could leverage their whining to help encourage adults, parents, to buy products that they may not have otherwise bought. The final necessary component of the comic book explosion that happened in the late 1930s occurred when comic books began to fall into the distribution network of the American News Company. The American News Company was the largest magazine distribution company in the United States, and this finally enabled comic books to appear on newsstands separately from other publications where their colorful covers might do the most damage to children's allowances. Shortly after comic books made their debut, the first superheroes made their debuts as well. And one of the first and most successful of these was Superman. In 1938, Superman was able to show that there was a large audience for comics if they could connect with readers. With sales of 1.3 million copies for Superman compared with the average sales of around 200 to 400,000 copies for other comic books, this launches a wave of imitation. So much so that DC Comics publishers Harry Dunfield and Jack Leibowitz began to sue anyone who published anything remotely resembling Superman. The rest of the industry then had to start looking elsewhere for new ideas. Therefore, new superheroes began to erupt with superpowers increasingly odd in comparison. Among these increasingly bizarre heroes, you have people like Hourman, who only had superpowers for 1 hour of the day, and perhaps the more well-known but equally weird Green Lantern, who in the comic books finds a railroad lantern powered by a meteorite from China, who then turns that meteorite into a magic ring, which is kind of weird. Among all of these somewhat strange characters emerges a relatively simple character with few powers and wrapped in the American flag, and that is Captain America. So, looking at Captain America comics, he was first created in 1940 while Europe was embroiled in the Second World War and the United States had not yet abandoned its isolationism to join in the fight. Most comics studiously avoided the topic of the war in Europe for 2 primary reasons. One, a character like Superman didn't really fit into the narrative, as he would likely be able to win the war single-handedly. 2, the industry was also wary of offending isolationists, and as a result, losing business. As news of events like Kristallnacht, which the name refers to a wave of violent anti-Jewish pogroms, which took place on November 9th and 10th in 1938. This wave of violence took place throughout Germany, annexed Austria, and in areas of the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia, which had been recently occupied by German troops. This event, as well as other Nazi plans for Jews in Europe, led American Jews to start moving away from the ideas of isolationism, especially visible among the creators of comic books who were almost uniformly Jewish. After a series of flops, Simon developed the idea of a hero who would be specifically opposed to Hitler. That is Joe Simon, one of the creators of Captain America. There had never been a truly believable villain in comics, but Adolf Hitler was alive, hated by more than half of the world, and honestly, a perfect comic book villain. Therefore, Joe Simon decided to design a hero whose alter ego would be in the armed forces. A costume was designed drawing on the American flag for its themes and giving the character a shield shaped like a police badge with the same Star-Spangled theme. The first issue of Captain America comics came out in December of 1940 and featured Captain America on the cover punching Adolf Hitler right in the jaw. Thus, the first issue of Captain America was an overtly political statement about what the United States ought to be doing. This first issue sold over 1 million copies, as did each of the following issues, but the impact was probably far larger than that number would suggest. Market research in 1943 suggested that while 25 million comics were bought every month, each of these was probably read by at least 4 or 5 different readers. Comics were banned in Nazi-controlled Europe and fascist Italy, and so publishers became much more overt with their anti-fascist rhetoric. Again, remember, many of these publishers are Jewish. It is important to note that the first 10 issues of Captain America, where the character gets much of his development, and the first issue where he's socking Hitler in the jaw, is issued prior to the US actually entering the war at all. Now, we're going to move on, and in the next lecture, talk a little bit about the design of the character and what that represents.